Welcome to SUP, the Super Urban Podcast, a discussion on cities coming from RMIT Architecture and Urban Design in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. I'm Ian Nazareth.
I'm Graham Christ.
And I'm Christine Phillips.
Conrad Hamann's discussion of divided and fragmented cities describes stressed and dystopic places, urban environments that have become irreconcilable through ideologies, difference, of religion or of ethnicity. That discussion is highly charged with terms like ghetto, apartheid or redlining. It's an urban image drawn with walls and barbed wire fences, but also with invisible virtual or administrative borders. Names like Berlin, Belfast, Soweto, Harlem, Jim Crow or Gaza all invoke powerful images of conflict and separation in cities. This is contrasted with cities separated from their outside and by protective walls, or twin cities united like Budapest or Minneapolis St Paul, and the tendency of a metropolis to absorb and join up villages, London and Tokyo as great examples. We need to remember too that our conversation is happening on a city grid built on the unceded ground of a displaced population. Australian cities had formal apartheid systems, for example Perth CBD's aboriginal exclusion zone until 1954 and boundary streets that separated Indigenous Australians from non-Indigenous Australians. Hamann also talks about vertical and horizontal urban divisions, the stratification in the section of a tower, a literal underclass through height separation, but also the horizontal fragmentation that can be induced by urban infrastructure like freeways. What is often remarkable is the ability of a city's people to ignore or to be consciously blind to an extreme division. Those borders are often invisible.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome back, Conrad and the team. Let's start with a film I saw not long ago, Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest, 2023 film with the fabulous Sandra Huller. It describes family life in the home of an administrator just outside the Auschwitz death camp. It's an incredibly disturbing film, and it's also one of the most extreme examples of segregation and boundaries which help define an orderly city. I was wondering what your thoughts are on these kind of extreme separations, or perhaps the ability of its inhabitants to turn a blind eye even while they fully understand the realities that they are turning the blind eye to.
I've been horrified for years at the capacity of people to exist in a state of undeclared war, which is, in this case, probably argued through adjacency, through people's capacity to live alongside a circumstance that one would feel would normally provoke violent reaction or an extraordinary reaction against what was happening or what was going on. But in fact, you see people coexisting in this way. In another sense, it's the same way that you see people stepping over prone people in the street, as in New York City, for example, which was a fairly routine sight. And particularly, I think, I remember that the US particularly was proud of its capacity to acknowledge its social ailments and ills. I think the implication was that nobody else did. I don't think that's true, but I think there was often a justification for such coexistence, such juxtapositions, by saying it was an acknowledgement of social circumstances.
Yeah, there's something in this film where the scale of the horror is, so much more than someone lying prone in the street.
Oh, very much more. Yes.
And David Rumsman's podcast has a discussion of this, and they're talking about how people happily coexist with this reality, and they're fully knowledgeable of it. But the one character is Sandra Huller's mother comes to visit, and she just can't cope. She doesn't say why she can't cope, but the whole thing just drives her a little bit insane. But it's this it's really compelling to watch. It's almost like an acknowledgement that the the beautiful suburban context is there thanks to the horror that's going on the other side of the wall.
I mean, is that something to do with the difference between a physical separation? So there's only so much we can do in our built environments in terms of physically separating us, and it's the social segregations which actually play out quite differently to those physical boundaries.
Yeah, in our really low density cities, we're kind of happy to have stratification as long as it's a bit distant. And I think what is shocking when you go to places like New York often is how quickly it can change spatially.
I think so. You can often, the character of a neighbourhood, so-called, will change in the space of a block or of 2 blocks. The trip from Central Park West through Amsterdam, Columbus, Broadway, West End, and then Riverside Drive is quite dramatic in that sense, because there's a significant shift in neighbourhood character from one block to the next, literally. And when there, you tend to develop eyes in the back of your head for just sensing the shift in the neighbourhood areas. In some parts of San Francisco, the Western Addition and Tenderloin area, you get some very similar, very rapid changes of neighbourhood from one block to the next in a grid pattern.
I mean, I'm also thinking that even in a city like Melbourne, there are moments where those changes do seem to be quite exaggerated, like the shift from, say, South Bank to South Melbourne, for instance, and where you almost see the sort of boundaries of, I guess, city councils being drawn out and how they have different, regulations or different kinds of development that they encourage. And do you think something like that would become more apparent as cities continue to densify?
Well, I think it's evident in Sydney as well. There was a great difference between Macleay Street and the walk through to Victoria Street and King's Cross, where you suddenly can sense the whole atmosphere of the block changing. If you go down Plummer Street or Orwell Street or something, you suddenly realise you're in a slightly menacing environment, somewhat menacing environment, just in the space of 50 metres or so. So yes, you do get that sort of, that intense change from near adjacency in Australian cities, in various locations, I think.
It's interesting way to think of those sudden changes in some ways are the opposite of a divided city, insofar as you can just cross the street and something will change, which is, I guess, in some ways the opposite of a wall, which might separate two things which are on the face quite similar.
Yes, the walls seem to... Well, the walls are there presumably as some sort of protective device, either for ideological purity or for ethnic homogeneity or religious adherence, as with, say, Belfast, for example. People have talked about life in Northern Ireland and the capacity of people to identify their particular brand of Christianity by just their appearance or their inflections in language or clothing, or just, it's become almost a sixth sense that you divide people into the two religious groups there. And I think there are all sorts of very similar definitions and distinctions.
Yeah, it's interesting, again, the sort of extreme difference within a single urban environment versus, sameness or similarity divided by a wall. So you can have, German families that were entirely separated in Berlin.
On one side of the wall in 1961 and on the other side. Yeah,
and Conrad, I think on the sort of topic about, the specificity of the wall, in Berlin is probably the most sort of supreme example of a modern divided city. And there have been examples of cities with divisions and separated enclaves, but having never experienced that city with a wall dividing it in half, it's hard to believe such a move would have been made, of something being so physically present. And I guess its destruction, of course, represented a profound shift in our understanding of global order. And here I'm sort of reminded of Francis Fukuyama's, the political scientist and economist who described the imminent fall of the Berlin Wall as the end of history and the last man. And the end of history being the triumph of liberal democracy over the socialist, fascist ideals, and the fact that there would no longer be any competing ideology. Of course, these ideas haven't perhaps stated too well.
No, they haven't.
But it also seems inconceivable that we would ever be building walls again, let alone along national frontiers like Mexico, for instance.
It is interesting that because the principal instigator of the wall with Mexico was in the same party as Ronald Reagan, who gave the immortal quote, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall." And so same party but different era, and reminded me of the barbed wire fence that separated Thuringia from Bavaria. When you went through Germany, 1989, one of the railway lines just ran alongside this barbed wire fence, and you could see Thuringen on the other side, but with green fields and farmlands and so on, but separated by this extraordinary fence. And it is interesting because, of course, the division of cities also extended to a dimension where parts of countries would be divided up with similar fences, as we well know. Both with Gaza being surrounded by a fence. Homelands in apartheid era South Africa was surrounded with fences and designated as restricted in movement. You had the multiple number plate system in Israel. Green number plates for Palestinian territories only, movement within Palestinian territories only. Yellow number plates for free movement within Israel generally, and I think there was a third category of number plates, white number plates or something like that, that allowed a different dimension of car movement through the various checkpoints that you would encounter along major highways.
Conrad, as I recall, you were in Berlin 10 days before the wall came down.
That's right, yeah. It was curiously relaxed. East Berlin looked like a big country town. It seemed to move more slowly. It spoke an older form of German. There were horses and donkeys and carts in the street with roadside braziers and people fixing the cobblestones. And there were cranes on the skyline, which was interesting. And I assumed that some sort of building boom was taking place. But when I went in there, I found actually that most of the cranes were restoring 3 or 4 older buildings that finally the East German authorities had got round to restoring Schinkel's Great Theatre in the central southern area of the Mitte district, the central district in Berlin, and I think one was working on one of the Baroque so-called cathedrals, the large church buildings that were put up in the 18th century. So in other words, primarily they were there for restoration, not as part of some building boom. But they gave the impression from a distance of dynamic prosperity and movement, which was actually quite different when you experienced going in. At that stage, at least, most of the border controls were about people bringing in hard currency. So I think that the sense of espionage at the border had receded, and the guards and the general atmosphere in Old East Berlin, or Berlin der Hauptstadt, it advertised itself at least we're the capital of something, as opposed to West Berlin, which was not allowed to be the capital of anything. But there was this sense of relaxation that seemed to be pervading the whole place. There were a lot of crowds that gathered around the wall in that period, about 10 days before.
So there was a sense that it was brewing, and
things were changing, I think.
Yeah.
Things were changing, and probably the Berliners had a more acute sense of in terms of just the vibes as to what was happening or what was about to happen. And about 10 days later, I remember watching the breaching of the wall on Finnish television.
I mean, for all the things you could say about it that are weird, I mean, the fact that the sort of urban population just got used to it and lived with it.
Lived with it.
Through lack of choice in many ways, but
Yeah.
it is.
The shrug of the shoulders gets you an awfully long way in 20th and 21st century urban environments.
Indeed. Well, Conrad, changing the subject slightly, but we together wrote a paper with Ian not long ago called Nothing to See Here, speaking of ignoring barriers, but we discussed the Australian urban condition as a kind of an apparent avoidance or an absence of conflict, but where conflict or division is really made invisible. And one, amongst other things, very low density creates a kind of a horizontal division, and perhaps there's no better place to hold things apart than a sprawling Canberra.
Yes, Canberra was fascinating. Just to drive through Canberra, to go through, seemingly 20 or 30 kilometres of wandering, curving roads, and 20 to 30 kilometres of single-storey suburban good taste. There are a series of houses which don't have the very considerable statements of individuality that you get in suburbia and other cities, presumably because there are legislative controls on streetscape controls which homogenise the suburban texture. So in a sense it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of repetition and uniformity and sameness, which in actual fact is probably not nearly as pronounced in suburbs in older Australian cities, which are in many cases much more individual than the rows of terraces and the lines of cars outside the terraces that you get in what are supposedly far more individualist suburbs in their expression, i.e. the inner suburbs. I think people have underestimated the individuality of expression within, say, middle and outer suburban Australia, although councils themselves have now begun to actually enforce measures of uniformity, such as dark grey roofs, for example, on outer suburban houses, which is climatically nonsensical, but which now seems to be ordained, or the extraordinary circumstance in Altona Meadows where you actually had to design a house in period styles and that houses in modern form, you had to actually really argue a case with the councils there to actually get a house built that didn't have period character, which is very interesting because there's a tendency for authority then to ordain visual aspects, and it's reached a considerable level in Canberra.
Yeah, going back even further in Australia, and something you three picked up on your article is that long, brutal colonial past that we have, and some of our listeners might not be aware that we have many roads across Australian cities called Boundary Road, and this was essentially a racial segregation and division between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. So they established these roads, which were literally called boundary roads, and they're still called boundary roads, where Indigenous Australians weren't allowed to step over that boundary. So it wasn't the physical wall that you get in Berlin, but it was a road that created that division. But it's interesting to see how many layers of segregation that have sort of surfaced in Australian cities in different ways, in a much more subtle but no less brutal way than what we see play out in the sort of extreme examples.
Yeah, well, there were similarly boundary roads in, say, Atlanta and Detroit, for example, which determine people living on one side of these roads or one side of the other road. Similarly, railway tracks, of course, the old expression wrong side of the tracks, also, of course, referred to railway areas dividing up cities. Freeways probably do this much more effectively because they consume far greater area for the most part than do railways or traditional roads.
Well, that's true. Major infrastructure, roads. You also speak about the division between the north and south side of the river in Melbourne.
Yes,
in
very much so.
Sydney, it being about the harbour.
About north and south
North
of the
and south
harbour.
of the
That's quite a
harbour.
significant boundary.
Absolutely.
With, of course, the official imagery and the almost the urban ideology of Sydney taking its cue from either the immediate surrounding of the harbour or the North Shore, rather than western suburbs or the St George region or East Hills, Banks, Canterbury, Bankstown, the parts of Sydney that don't figure predominantly in public presentations of the city. That it's really, it's the harbour city and the water city and so on. Even if people in the south and the west mightn't get anywhere near the harbour from one month to the next. And Australian cities do divide themselves that way. They divide themselves segmentally. Like, I think there's a very pronounced difference between the western side of Perth, for example, and the eastern side of Perth, from beyond about, say, Belmont or Midland, and the south side of Perth, Bentley and the areas south of Fremantle, very distinct in character from say the beachside suburbs to the immediate north, and the Stirling Highway curving around towards the central city. I think that there's a very considerable difference there. In Adelaide, there tends to be a significant difference between the south and the north.
I mean, this isn't particularly Australian, isn't it? Is it? Would you say? I mean, is this something that we see a form of that segregation in cities across the world, or is there something about our horizontal, vast land that we live on that seems to prompt this way of organising? Or
I'm wondering about this. Certainly, you do tend to feel it's an experience of living in Australia. That Brisbane, for example, has a north side where the suburbs are significantly different in character from, so the more industrial suburbs to the southwest, for example. Perhaps it's more segmental rather than simply a north-south boundary. But it's also true, I think, that older American cities, I'm thinking of Philadelphia, for example, will have pockets of wealth, almost sort of hard by areas, industrial areas, and the spread, the dimensions of those constituent areas tend to be much smaller. I think you'd find that in New York, for example, just the proximity, for example, to the east side, east of Fifth Avenue, which is, of course, the Mayfair of New York's monopoly board. But then, of course, north of about 91st Street, you get Spanish Harlem, which was a far more impoverished area even than Afro-American Harlem, which was started at about 121st. So you did get these very sudden changes, and dimensionally areas that were much smaller than, say, the shift that you might get in the transition of Melbourne across the swamps to Footscray and to the western suburbs in Melbourne.
You just heard West Australian musician Sam Tout from his 2024 debut album Just Floating Around. That's called Televithem.
What about if we think about these types of divisions vertically? I'd like to hear you talk about vertical divisions, particularly in relation to class divisions in cities. And I mean, the term underclass is quite literally rendered as one space below another in some of these vertical divisions. You've discussed Fritz Langer's Metropolis in relation to this, and I think H.G. Wells's Time Machine describes a subterranean subspecies.
Yes.
You get it with the Parisian apartments, and of course the stratification of the poorer dwellings at the top, since they had more stairs to climb.
Poorer at the top.
Yes, quite the inverse.
Yeah.
Yes. Because they didn't have lifts, and they had a separate entry, and you had to climb up a lot of stairs. So that's where and of course, that we could have a whole discussion on that in itself. But tell me a little bit more about these vertical divisions in cities.
Well, sometimes they're mixed verticals and horizontals as well. For example, light well apartments in the United States are very different in terms of their implications in stratification from, say, apartments that have views of the street outside. There's a very considerable difference involved there. And, of course, light well apartments are a major option in New York housing, or perhaps not so much an option. Perhaps they're compulsory for a great many people in terms of rent levels. But yes, vertical stratification, it's certainly been heavily imaged through films such as Metropolis and, probably Blade Runner 2, actually, where the corporate headquarters, by occupation, the higher up in the building you were, the higher you ranked. And I think that's a significant factor as well. I think that was illustrated. It was even illustrated in some films noir, such as The Big Clock, for example, which was a Ray Milland film directed by John Farrow in the 1940s, that took a hypothetical high-rise or medium to high-rise building and showed stratification and siloing within that building. Likewise, the whole idea of the penthouse consolidated in New York, where you got Baroque villas sitting on top of Beaux-Arts apartment towers, particularly along Central Park West. This is quite dramatic. Because, of course, these houses that seem to have been dropped onto rooftops then overlooked Central Park. So they actually had a kind of maximum spectator access to a major area, perhaps for many people, the principal or only area of greenery in the central city. So in other words, yes, there was this privileging, and it was demonstrated in a very interesting way in houses on that block of Central Park West and one block running back from that. They had a curious resemblance to Soviet towers of the 1930s, particularly in terms of elaborate rooftop superstructures. But yes, the idea of villas on top of high-rise was an interesting notion, and not really addressed in the histories of modern architecture, which tended to just takes tall buildings as a homogeneous form from top to bottom. I don't think predominantly the general histories of modern architecture for a long time really addressed the issues of stratification inside tall buildings at all.
In relation to class in particular, I think it's very interesting.
I don't think they did, no.
Maybe Delirious New York goes towards that.
I think Delirious New York did, because I think Kohlhaas was very interested in the idea of a fantasy realm that could be played out in tall buildings. And Kohlhaas was connected with the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York, who had, as I recall, several exhibitions on the subject of skyscraper style and the implications of skyscraper style. They expanded their survey to include eclectic buildings rather than pure buildings of the kind of Chicago to Mies axis that had been favoured in earlier forms of architectural history writing.
I mean, I'm also, Conrad, thinking about, in relation to Christine's point earlier about, talking about the Parisian houses. I mean, I'm reminded of a similar strategy in Barcelona as well. And this was part of, Ildefonse's sort of Eixample, or the expansion plan for the city.
Yes.
Where the idea of stratification was quite intentional in the sense that it was meant to describe a sort of social condenser where each building, or so rather than having separate zones where, landowners might live, and each building is in fact, a site where every floor is, like every floor in every building has a retail or has an owner and has rental property. So it was, in some ways, it's been used as a more instrumental way to kind of get away from the idea that you might have separate zones for, the more wealthy and the more affluent people in the city, and here it's more mixed.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, whether that's another sort of application of the similar idea of sort of stratification that's done with a bit more intention.
Yes, well, it was, in some ways, it's actually a reversal of zoning tendencies on the part of notable modern architects. Le Corbusier's City of 3 Million, for example, assumes that an underclass literally would come in from ground level, work their way up into the technocrats' towers gathered around that airport piazza at the centre of the Corbusian vision, and that they would then presumably retreat or creep back elsewhere into some realm of their own, largely left indeterminate, but presumably near ground level. So in a sense there was a measure of vertical stratification, but also of zoning and of movement through the day, which corresponded to allocating certain hours to activities such as punching bags, swimming up and down in swimming pools, and attending to your technocratic duties and so on. So there was, however, Corbusier then proposed something quite different with his move into freeway-topped city extensions, so that the Algiers extensions, for example, his drawings of those are full of all sorts of individual approaches to construction in what appear to have been initially undifferentiated and planar layers, and people have filled these layers in, sometimes with arched buildings, sometimes with roofed gardens, and with literally nights in the gardens of Spain, as it were, inside the fabric of that multi-storey structure that would support those freeways. So, in other words, yes, it seems to be a kind of an institutionalised pluralism, which in odd ways anticipated or preceded the domestication of house owners or house occupants, as with Corbusier's Pessac housing, for example, where they start to convert them with window boxes and reshape the windows and add mouldings to the outside and tiles along the cornices and so on. So you actually were almost, Corbusier anticipates that with his depiction of freeway cities.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I mean, the mega structural image that sort of imagines is in some ways far less curated or socially engineered, potentially.
Yes, it's creating an initially indifferent form and surroundings to space that would then be occupied and would gain specific character from the mode of people's occupation of those.
I'm thinking, by contrast, a really vivid image of that social stratification in the Korean film Parasite, where you literally get the basement as the
you literally
dark
go below
underbelly.
street level to these flood-prone basement regions, and this hellish set of interiors that from which people would emerge, and they would then go into to serve luxurious accommodation above ground level. Yeah, there's literally a vertical stratification that characterises the soul of the SEUO or SEOUL of parasite, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a contrast. And maybe thinking about Ian's description of Barcelona. I for a time lived on the 7th floor of a Parisian apartment, and it was absolutely tiny. It was former nurses' quarters.
Right.
But every day you'd go up the stairs past some quite substantial bourgeois apartments, and you'd see the big double doors and so on.
Yes, yeah.
And I mean, there's a form of stratification there, but at least as Ian was saying, it's in one building rather than a separate urban zone.
Did you have a separate entry? So it was literally
no.
Because I think some of them used to have a separate entry for the
I
rooftop.
see, they had separation.
One, they literally had separation for the housemaids or.
Well, then there's the tradition of the aristocratic house with an entirely separate circulation zone.
Exactly. But I
one
think
never
that
had to see the servants.
played
Or
out
the phenomenon of
that's
backstairs.
exactly what it was about in the Parisian model. So, which I find fascinating because it is so the inverse of how we imagine the sort of the underbelly as being the lower class, and the high ego is the class.
We were
but
allowed
actually
up the main stairs.
Right, but not everyone was, and there was quite elaborate provision of back stairs and of ways in which servants could move around. A whole servant class could move around wealthier houses with being seen as little as possible, or being seen in decorous ways in terms of a choreographed sequence of appearances.
I mean, you'd even see in 1950s apartments, there'd often be the door called the tradesman's entrance.
Yeah. There was a regular part series, Perry Mason, the private detective who was attached to Perry Mason's amazing evidence-finding activity, would always appear out of a hole-in-the-wall door to greet Perry's secretary with "Hi, beautiful," etc. And he would disappear back into his hole-in-the-wall again to go about. Yeah, so there were two entrances to Perry Mason's office with the view of Los Angeles City Hall outside the window and so on. But clearly,
that film noir vision of the sort of the New York fire escape. Metallic stairs.
Yes. Those clip-on fire escapes. They, however, also had certain associations with urban poverty and decay. That where you got the external fire escapes, you also got a sudden drop-off in neighbourhood esteem and neighbourhood elan, where you didn't get too many sliding fire escapes or clip-on fire escapes on the upper or the Middle East side, let's say, whereas they were common enough. And you didn't get them on Central Park West either, or West End, or Riverside Drive to nearly the same degree that you got them on Amsterdam and Columbus Avenues on the New York Upper West Side either. But they're almost a signature of literally, when that sort of neighbourhood change was condensed and presented as icons. You certainly got it in West Side Story, for example, as a component, or the embodiment of
the place
slums.
that invites crime, the place where you hang out and you do your drug deals and smoking.
Yes.
I don't know. Is this what we're talking about, Conrad?
I think so. There were elements
the tack-on stairs then becomes the.
It becomes almost an insignia of decline.
Behaviour.
Yeah, in New York, of course, it's also accompanied, and this is less obviously addressed in TV series or in films. But when the railways come out from underground, and they become L tracks on portal frame, steel portal frames running along, that's also where, of course, the two Harlems appear in New York City, is exactly the point when the railways come out from underground and your apartment is alongside a railway track. It works a bit differently in Chicago because they're much more universal as a characteristic in streetscapes in Chicago than they are in New York, but it's certainly accompanied deterioration in the quality of the road surface, the emergence of cobbled streets in ghetto areas recognised or areas understood to be ghettos of different types. Those were characteristics that really marked out major transition of regions and neighbourhoods.
So now we're moving to horizontal stratification or division, the sort of front and the back, the big street, main street versus the alley and so on. I mean, Melbourne's got this sort of layered system of main streets, little streets, Little Collins Street, Little Burke Street and so on.
And then a third
of
alleyways behind that.
So I mean, was there originally an intention that they were sort of graded in the same way?
I think that emerged almost accidentally in the sense that the original survey of Melbourne just had the main streets, and I think the governor up in Sydney recognised fairly quickly that these areas are too deep to be serviced in a logical manner. So he actually required the surveyors to insert the little streets in between what was originally Melbourne as a collection of squares, and from those, the alleyways seem to emerge almost impromptu, perhaps because the original density of Melbourne was much more as sort of separate residential buildings that allowed street access or vehicle access between buildings before real estate pressure increased, so that in a sense the vehicular access of earlier buildings remained as designated alleyways. And when sections of Melbourne were rebuilt, particularly in the 1960s and the 1970s, early 80s as corporate towers, a lot of those alleyways were obliterated or filled in. And then, of course, you had the odd turnaround where they're actually now encouraged as part of the design of new corporate buildings, which began to happen round about the late 1990s, really, where you started to get, you got the Queen Victoria Centre and you got the William Street group that Bates Smart designed, incorporating reconstituted alleyways.
And ARM successfully did that by fixing up Kurakawa's shopping centre at Melbourne Central.
Yes, they did. Yes, and the second phase refurbishment of Melbourne Central, which had a significantly different form in its 1985 its Daimaru manifestation, 1990 manifestation, than it did after 1999.
Yeah, well, the revitalisation of laneways in Melbourne's pretty interesting, and I think partially relates to the change of legislation with the liquor licensing when Jeff Kennett was Premier of Victoria, where there was a relaxing of the liquor licensing to allow bars to open up without having a food, and so a lot of people started. Well, that invited small business people and creative types to start opening bars in laneways, and really began to transform. And then that permeated to larger buildings and institutions and shopping centres, as you mentioned, Graham, because we began to fall in love with the laneways and realise that there was something really interesting to this sort of urban spatial condition. And then, interestingly, a lot of other cities around Australia began to sort of build and construct laneways within their cities artificially.
Yeah, yes, or develop anything that resembled a laneway in a similar pattern. Yeah.
I mean, a couple of these sort of points. I mean, what strikes me as really kind of fascinating is how for each of these sort of ideas there is perhaps a specific typology of street or space that conjures up that kind of imagery. And here I'm sort of also thinking about there's this fascinating sort of opening sequence in Woody Allen's Manhattan, where he sort of describes the quality of a city, and it's sort of a narration that goes over a series of images, but they move so quickly in the span of about 4 minutes to talking about something that is quite utopian, where you see, vast sort of boulevards, and you see, the kind of buildings that we're describing, and then it slowly moves to the back alleys and, you know, the kind of the fire escapes to kind of describe a more dystopian sort of context of the city. But it's all kind of set through the imagery of the city that can very quickly sort of describe, you know, a qualitative spatial agenda. And
Yes. Yeah, I think what sort of parallels we have in Australia, there was certainly a move in the early 1990s to revitalise Australian cities by developing cafe society, pavement cafes, tables and bonnet chairs and areas like that. It was there was an initiative there, and I remember being concerned at the time that actually this ignored the middle and outer suburbs by and large, which still had isolating factors such as huge freeway areas, long commuting distances, and suburban shopping centres that either hadn't developed a capacity for said cafe society or didn't have the formal potential to do so. So in other words, it was a vision that was really centred on old established central business districts or on inner suburbs of various sorts. But the inner suburbs often didn't have that capacity either.
So Conrad, you know, perhaps another dimension of division and fragmentation in cities is probably the realm of pandemics and quarantines. And I guess here I'm probably going to plug another essay that we wrote on pestilential cities.
Pestilential cities.
Yeah, where I guess part of that idea was to kind of talk about how the relationship between, you know, the design of whole cities and its association with illness and contagion, perhaps, to some degree also predates the ideas of the city as an industry or the city as a social realm, or the city as a theatre. And dare we go back here, but for most of us, the most recent experience of a divided city was the urban lockdown and the quarantines of COVID-19. So Melbourne had a long run of these. It established a so-called ring of steel around the metropolitan boundary and a 5-kilometre travel limit. And this highlighted a lot of inequities where, you know, a very large percentage of the city did not have access to green space.
Yes, to parkland particularly.
Yeah, parkland either.
Yeah.
But it was perhaps most acute in the in the instances of the social housing towers in North Melbourne. But generally, it was also a shock to our imagination of a city now suddenly having these very sharp boundaries, or a city not being borderless.
Yes, that you suddenly have the phenomenon of major borders inside Australian cities of a type that had not been seen as distinctly as perhaps cities that had been affected by communalism overseas, where American cities would have very distinct ethnic regions within urban structures, and these persisted in a lot of the cities for many, many years, and in some cases still do, whereas Australia tended to be much more open about that. But then you got a series of artificial boundaries within Australian cities because of COVID. I think the case of the public housing too was particularly disturbing, that it was possible to lock residents in public housing into a very constricted area. It's almost as if the Housing Commission towers in, say, Melbourne particularly, I don't know what happened with Sydney's considerable array in Alexandria and Waterloo and suburbs like that, but certainly in Melbourne, in Flemington and elsewhere, Flemington, Carlton and elsewhere, it's almost as if they were being read as those cruise ships that would pull into harbours and disgorge hundreds of COVID-infected patients who would then disappear into the night and spread themselves through the city. It's almost as if those towers were seen in that sense as enormous ship-like vessels of contagion.
The things people have always feared, foreigners and poor people.
And of course foreigners and poor people, because they were originally built to house immigrants. They were built in an austere manner because the government in the 1950s, who was sort of handling the financing of this was very concerned that these buildings would not become long-term accommodation, that families who moved into those flats would be encouraged, in inverted commas, to move on at a reasonably early opportunity. Now, I think we've talked about this previously, but I think it meant that, in fact, such towers tended to be associated with people who were poorer financially and often more recent in their arrival and less cemented in their linkages to Melbourne society. And I'm not quite sure how that relates to the desire, which I don't think has been fully explained yet, of pulling these buildings down, except to say that there is a desire within social engineering to obliterate something that came to stand for a particular pattern of living, and there's an ample precedent for demolition of high-rise public housing, from Pruitt-Igoe in St Louis in the early 1970s through to the demolition of the Gorbals Towers in Glasgow, which are uncannily similar to Melbourne's public housing in terms of towers and proportions, even their external appearances. Mm.
Yes, well, we did go back there, and hopefully we won't have to again soon.
Mm.
But maybe we're gonna leave that divisive subject right there. And
well, I think people have just bypassed lockdowns as a way of addressing COVID. I think it all became too much. COVID's still very much there, as ever it was. I mean, lots of us have been ill with COVID. I was ill with COVID last year, which is 4.5 years after the initial outbreak. But I think people just don't want it to be there anymore.
Let's leave it at that then. There's so much more to say about the divisions in our cities, most of them being invisible, but those rare cases of the physical boundaries teach us a lot about our sense of the city as open and limitless. Next week, in our final episode of the series, we'll talk about that inverse, the city as endless, multiple, and without edges.
You're hearing us thanks to the generous support of the Alistair Swain Foundation and the Armati University School of Architecture and Urban Design. We would like to acknowledge the people of the Bunwurrung and Woiwurrung language groups on whose unceded country we are recording this podcast, and extend that acknowledgement to all First Peoples of Australia who have been caring for the many layers of country for over 60,000 years.